When you picture an Ottoman princess, what comes to mind? Is it lavish palaces, shimmering silks, and a life of effortless luxury? For centuries, that's the image the world has seen, a fairy tale of power, wealth, and beauty. But what if I told you that behind the gilded doors and marble halls, a very different story was unfolding? What if the gold was a cage and the silk was a shroud? This is the forgotten truth about the Ottoman princesses. A story not of fairy tales, but of sacrifice, heartbreak, and a life lived in a gilded prison. To understand their lives, you first need to understand the system they were born into. In the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan's power was absolute. The stability of the entire empire rested on a clear and undisputed line of succession. This obsession with order had a profound and often tragic impact on the women of the imperial family. From the moment they were born, princesses or sultanas were not seen as individuals. They were political assets, pawns in a great game of power played by the men around them. Their value was tied directly to their ability to forge alliances through marriage. Their childhood was a carefully orchestrated preparation for this role. While they received the finest education in literature, music, and the arts, it wasn't for their personal enrichment. It was to make them more desirable brides for powerful viziers, pashas, or provincial governors. Their lives were meticulously controlled. They couldn't choose their friends, their hobbies, or even the clothes they wore without approval. Every step was watched, every word was noted. The freedom that even the most common person in the empire might take for granted was completely alien to them. Imagine being a young girl, knowing your entire future is already decided, knowing you will be married off to a much older man you've never met, sent away to a distant part of the empire, and expected to serve the political interests of your father or brother. This was the standard path for many Ottoman princesses. Love was a luxury they could not afford. The concept of marrying for affection was simply not part of their world. Their duty was to the dynasty, not to their own hearts. These marriages were often far from happy. A princess would arrive in her new husband's home, a stranger in a strange land. While she held a high rank, she was often isolated. Her husband, a powerful statesman, was typically consumed by his political career and military campaigns. He might have other wives and a household with its own complex politics. The princess was expected to navigate this new environment with grace and dignity, all while representing the Sultan's authority. She was a symbol of the connection between the central government and the province, and any misstep could have serious political consequences. Life in the imperial harem in Istanbul wasn't much better. The harem is often romanticized, but in reality, it was a highly structured and hierarchical institution. It was a world of intense competition, where women vied for the favor of the Sultan and, through him, for power. A princess born into this world was surrounded by intrigue from day one. While her rank gave her certain privileges, it also made her a target. She had to be constantly vigilant, careful of whom she trusted. The architecture of the palace itself tells a story. The Topkapi Palace's harem section is a labyrinth of rooms, courtyards, and corridors, all designed to keep the women of the court hidden from public view. This seclusion was framed as protection, a way to preserve their honor, but in reality, it was a form of confinement. They were cut off from the outside world, their lives unfolding entirely within the palace walls. They couldn't simply go for a walk in the city or visit a market. Their world was beautiful, ornate, but incredibly small. One of the most striking aspects of a princess's life was the lack of personal agency. Her marriage wasn't the only decision made for her. If a husband fell out of favor with the Sultan, he could be demoted, exiled, or even executed. In such cases, the princess would often be forced to return to the palace. Her marriage dissolved, her children's future uncertain. She might then be married off again to another official, her life once again uprooted to serve the dynasty's needs. Some princesses were married multiple times, their personal lives in a constant state of flux, entirely dependent on the political winds. And what about the children of these princesses? One might think they would enjoy a high status, but the reality was more complicated. The sons of princesses, known as sultanzads, were often viewed with suspicion. Because they carried royal blood through their mother, they could potentially be seen as rivals to the main line of succession. As a result, they were typically barred from holding the highest government positions and were kept under close watch. A princess's love for her son was tempered by the constant fear that his royal lineage could put him in danger. Perhaps the most tragic fate befell the sisters and daughters of a new sultan. When a sultan died and his son ascended the throne, the new ruler often saw his male relatives, his brothers and nephews, as threats. The infamous practice of fratricide, where a new sultan would execute his brothers to prevent civil war, is well documented. But what happened to the women? While they weren't executed, they were often marginalized. Unmarried princesses might be forced into marriages to neutralize any political power they might hold. Others were confined to the old palace, a place of retirement for the women of deceased sultans, where they would live out their days in relative obscurity. Think of Hatis, Sultan, the sister of the famous Suleiman the Magnificent. Her life is a powerful example. She was married to the Grand Vizier, Portugal, Brahim Pasha, a man she seems to have genuinely cared for. For a time, they were one of the most powerful couples in the empire. But when Ibrahim fell from grace and was executed on Suleiman's orders, Hadis's world collapsed. She was left a widow, her status shattered, and lived the rest of her life in sorrow. Her story reminds us that even for the most powerful princesses, happiness was fragile and entirely dependent on the whims of the sultan. There were, of course, exceptions. Some strong-willed princesses managed to carve out influence for themselves. They became patrons of art and architecture, funding the construction of mosques, hospitals, and fountains. Through these charitable works, they could leave a public legacy and exert a form of power that was socially acceptable. Figures like Mihrimah Sultan, the daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent, were known for their political savvy and influence. But these women were the exception, not the rule. And even they operated within the strict confines of the system. Their power was always indirect, wielded through their male relatives. So, when we look back at the Ottoman princesses, we must look beyond the portraits and the palace inventories. We must see the human beings behind the titles. We must see the young girls who dreamed of freedom, the wives who yearned for love, and the mothers who feared for their children. Theirs is not a story of pampered idleness, but one of profound sacrifice. They were the silent pillars of the Ottoman dynasty. Their personal happiness and freedom sacrificed for the sake of imperial stability. Their lives were a paradox, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, yet owning nothing of their own, held in the highest honor, yet possessing no personal liberty. The golden cage was still a cage. By remembering their true story, we gain a more complete and compassionate understanding of the Ottoman world, recognizing that behind the grand facade of empire there were real people whose lives were shaped and often crushed by the weight of the crown. Their story deserves to be told, not as a fairy tale, but as a powerful testament to the resilience and the hidden sorrows of women in power. For over 600 years, one empire dominated the crossroads of the world. It stretched across 3 continents, from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Indian Ocean. Its armies were feared, its art was revered, and its rulers, the sultans, were more than just kings. They were shadows of God on earth. This is the story of the Ottoman Empire, a tale of incredible power, ambition, and the secrets kept behind palace walls. So, how did a small tribe from Anatolia build one of the longest-lasting and most influential empires in history? It all started with a dream. The founder, Osman I, supposedly had a vision of a tree growing from his chest, its branches covering the world. This was interpreted as a divine sign that his descendants would rule a vast empire. Whether the story is true or not, it captured the spirit of the early Ottomans. They believed they were destined for greatness, and greatness they achieved. In 1453, a date that changed the world, the 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed II did the impossible. He conquered Constantinople, the legendary capital of the Byzantine Empire, a city that had resisted countless sieges for 1,000 years. Mehmed used massive cannons, some of the most powerful the world had ever seen, to breach the city's impenetrable walls. He even had his ships dragged overland to bypass the enemy's defenses. With this one single act, the Ottomans didn't just gain a new capital, they declared themselves the new Caesars, the heirs to the Roman Empire. They renamed the city Istanbul, and it became the glittering heart of their new world. Under Mehmed's successors, the empire entered its golden age. Think of Sultan Selim the Grim, who tripled the empire's size in just 8 years, conquering Egypt and becoming the guardian of Islam's holiest cities, Mecca and Medina. Then came his son, Suleiman, the Magnificent. In the West, they called him the Magnificent for the sheer splendor of his court. In his own empire, he was known as the Lawgiver, because he reformed the legal system, creating a code that would last for centuries. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire was at its absolute peak. Its borders stretched from Hungary to Iran, from North Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. The Mediterranean Sea was practically an Ottoman lake. The Sultan's top architect, Mimar Sinan, built breathtaking mosques and palaces that still define the skyline of Istanbul today. Ottoman arts, poetry, and science flourished. This wasn't just a military powerhouse. It was a vibrant center of culture and civilization that blended traditions from Europe, Asia, and Africa. But how did they manage such a vast and diverse empire? The secret was a unique system of control that started right inside the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. The palace wasn't just the Sultan's home. It was the government headquarters, the military academy, and the empire's nerve center all rolled into one. And at its core was the harem. Now, when we hear the word harem, we often think of a place filled with beautiful women solely for the Sultan's pleasure. But the reality was far more complex and political. The harem was the private domain of the Sultan's family, run by his mother, the Valid Sultan. She was often the most powerful woman in the empire, a political player in her own right. The women of the harem were not just concubines. They were educated and trained, and the one who gave birth to the Sultan's firstborn son could become incredibly influential. This created intense rivalries and political maneuvering. The harem was a world of whispers, alliances, and plots, where the fate of the empire could be decided. Then there was the Janissary Corps, the Sultan's elite infantry. These soldiers were unique. They were recruited as young boys from Christian families in the Balkans through a system called the Devsh. They were taken to Istanbul, converted to Islam, and trained to be fiercely loyal to the Sultan alone. They had no family ties to distract them. For centuries, the Janissaries were the most disciplined and feared fighting force in Europe. They were the tip of the Ottoman spear, winning battles from the deserts of Egypt to the plains of Hungary. This entire system, the Sultan at the top, the intricate politics of the harem, and the unwavering loyalty of the Janissaries, was designed for one purpose: to centralize power and ensure the empire's survival. For a long time, it worked beautifully. The Ottomans governed a multitude of ethnicities and religions with a surprising degree of tolerance, allowing Christians and Jews to practice their faiths as long as they paid a tax. This practical approach helped keep the peace in their diverse lands. But no empire lasts forever. The seeds of decline were sown even at the height of Ottoman power. One major problem was succession. Unlike European monarchies, where the eldest son typically inherited the throne, Ottoman tradition was a bit more brutal. When a new sultan came to power, he would often have his brothers executed to eliminate any potential rivals. This practice, known as fratricide, was seen as a necessary evil to prevent civil wars. Later, this was replaced by confining potential heirs to a part of the palace known as the cage. Princes would spend decades in isolation, often emerging with no experience in governing, which weakened the quality of leadership. Economically, the world was also changing. New sea routes, discovered by European explorers, bypassed the Ottoman trade monopolies. Silver flooding in from the Americas caused massive inflation, crippling the Ottoman economy. Militarily, the Janissaries, once the empire's greatest strength, became its weakness. They grew so powerful that they started interfering in politics, staging coups, and resisting the military modernization that was desperately needed to keep up with Europe's advancing armies. The turning point is often seen as the failed siege of Vienna in 1683. The Ottoman army, once unstoppable, was decisively defeated. This marked the beginning of a long and slow decline. Over the next 2 centuries, the empire began to lose territory. Nationalist movements, inspired by the French Revolution, started to rise up within its borders. The Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians there, all wanted their own independent nations. The Ottoman Empire became known as the sick man of Europe, a once great power slowly being carved up by its rivals. There were attempts at reform, a period known as the Tanzimat, where the Ottomans tried to modernize their government, military, and society. But it was often too little, too late. By the early 20th century, the empire was on its last legs. The final blow came with World War I. The Ottomans made the fateful decision to side with Germany and the Central Powers. After 4 years of brutal conflict, they were on the losing side. The victorious allies dismantled the empire, carving up its lands into the new countries we see in the Middle East today. In 1922, the last Ottoman Sultan was sent into exile, and the empire that had shaped the world for 6 centuries officially came to an end. From its ashes, a new nation, the Republic of Turkey, was born, led by the revolutionary figure Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Imagine being born into a world of unimaginable luxury, draped in silks and jewels, living within the breathtaking walls of Topkapi Palace. Sounds like a dream, right? For the daughters of the Ottoman sultans, this was their reality. But behind the glittering facade of their lives lay a truth far more complex and often far more tragic. These were the Ottoman princesses, women born to the highest station, yet whose lives were never truly their own. From the moment they drew their first breath, these princesses were seen as assets, crucial pieces in the intricate game of imperial politics. Their value wasn't in their intellect, their spirit, or their personal ambitions. It was in their bloodline. They were raised not to lead armies or govern provinces, but to be the ultimate diplomatic tools, the living embodiment of the empire's power and its strategy for stability. Their lives were a carefully orchestrated performance for the benefit of the state. Think about your own childhood. You had dreams, you had choices, you had the freedom to imagine who you wanted to become. Now, picture a childhood where your every move was scrutinized, your every word weighed. The Ottoman princesses were educated. Yes, they learned to read the Quran, to write beautiful poetry, and to compose music. They were taught impeccable manners and the complex etiquette of the imperial court, but woven into every lesson was the thread of obedience. They learned that their will was secondary to the will of their father, the Sultan, and by extension, the empire itself. The concept of personal choice, of falling in love and marrying for affection, was a fantasy they could not afford to entertain. That wasn't part of the curriculum. Their world was the harem, a place often misunderstood in the West. It wasn't just a collection of concubines. It was the private, domestic heart of the palace, a sprawling and complex society of women, children, and eunuchs, all governed by the powerful valid sultan, the sultan's mother. For a young princess, this was her universe. It was a golden cage. Here, she was surrounded by opulent servants at her beck and call, a wardrobe filled with the finest fabrics, meals fit for a queen. But it was a gilded prison nonetheless. She rarely saw the world outside the palace walls. Her companions were chosen for her days structured by a strict routine. It was a life of privilege, but also profound isolation. The most pivotal moment in a princess's life was her marriage, and this was never a matter of the heart. It was a cold, calculated political transaction. At ages as young as 12 or 14, princesses were married off to high-ranking officials, viziers, pashas, governors. These marriages were called damat alliances, with the grooms becoming damatwai, seriari, or imperial sons-in-law. The purpose was twofold. First, it bound powerful men to the dynasty through blood, ensuring their loyalty. A man married to the sultan's daughter was less likely to rebel. Second, it extended the sultan's eyes and ears across the vast empire. These imperial sons-in-law were often sent to govern distant provinces, and their princess wives served as a direct link back to the capital, unofficial but influential observers for the sultan. Can you imagine the fear and uncertainty of that moment? A young girl, barely a teenager, being sent away from the only home she's ever known, to marry a man who was often decades her senior, a man she had likely never even met. He was a stranger, chosen for his political utility, not his character or compatibility. Love was not a factor. Her happiness was not a consideration. Her duty was to produce heirs and to serve the political alliance her marriage represented. Once married, a princess's life changed dramatically. She would leave the imperial harem and establish her own palace, her own household. In a way, she gained a degree of autonomy she never had before. She managed a large staff, controlled a significant income, and often wielded considerable influence in her own right. Some princesses became patrons of art and architecture, commissioning mosques, fountains, and charitable foundations that still stand today. They hosted gatherings of poets and scholars, creating their own cultural salons. In this respect, they could carve out a sphere of power and influence for themselves. However, this newfound status was precarious. It was entirely dependent on her husband's success and his standing with the Sultan. If her husband fell out of favor, if he was executed for treason or incompetence, a common occurrence in the volatile world of Ottoman politics, her life would be thrown into turmoil. A widowed princess might be forced to marry again. Another political pawn in another strategic game. The cycle would simply repeat itself. Some princesses were married multiple times, their lives a series of alliances and losses, dictated entirely by the shifting sands of politics. Consider the story of Fatma Sultan, a daughter of Sultan Ahmed III. She was married at the age of 5. Yes, 5. While this was a betrothal, the political alliance was sealed. She would go on to be widowed and remarried multiple times throughout her life, each husband chosen to serve the empire's needs. Her personal feelings, her grief, her hopes, they were irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. Her life reads like a political ledger, not a personal biography. Or think about the psychological toll. These women were raised to suppress their own desires, to prioritize duty above all else. They were expected to be models of piety and decorum, yet they were surrounded by intrigue and power struggles. Disobedience was not an option. A princess who dared to defy her father's will, perhaps by refusing a marriage or, even worse, being discovered in a forbidden romance, would face severe consequences. The punishment could be lifelong confinement, social disgrace, or worse. The message was clear. Your life is not your own. It is a tool for the empire. Despite these immense constraints, it would be a mistake to view these women as merely passive victims. They were intelligent, educated, and resilient. Within the rigid framework of their lives, many found ways to exert their will and leave their mark. They used their wealth for philanthropy, their social standing to influence court politics, and their proximity to power to advocate for their children or allies. They navigated the treacherous currents of the court with skill and diplomacy, because their very survival depended on it. A princess's relationship with her brother, the Sultan, was particularly complex. She was his subordinate, but also his family. She could sometimes act as a trusted confidant, an advisor who could speak more freely than a vizier. But she could also be seen as a threat. The Ottoman succession was often a brutal affair, with brothers competing for the throne. While a princess couldn't inherit the throne herself, her sons from a powerful pasha could potentially become rivals to the main line of succession. This meant they were always under a certain degree of suspicion. Their stories are a powerful reminder that history is not just about battles and treaties. It's about people and the often unseen constraints that shape their existence. The Ottoman princesses lived lives of paradox. They were revered but controlled, wealthy but powerless in the ways that mattered most. They were born at the absolute pinnacle of society, yet they lacked the basic freedom to choose who to love or how to live. Their glittering world was a cage, and their legacy is a quiet testament to the human spirit's ability to endure and even find meaning within the most restrictive of circumstances. Their tale is woven into the very fabric of the Ottoman Empire, a story of silk and steel, of power and sacrifice. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this glimpse into the hidden lives of Ottoman royalty fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the forgotten corners of history. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Have you ever dreamed of being a princess, living in a magnificent palace, wearing beautiful gowns, and having everything you could ever wish for? It sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? But what if I told you that for many historical princesses, this fairy tale was actually a gilded cage? Today, we're pulling back the velvet curtains to reveal the hidden, often lonely, reality of a princess's life. Picture this: a sprawling palace with gilded halls, intricate tapestries, and gardens so vast they seemed to stretch on forever. This was a princess's home, but it was also her prison. From the moment she was born, the walls of the palace were the only world she knew. Sure, the views from her silk-draped windows were stunning. She could see the changing sky, the manicured landscapes, the distant city walls. But what she couldn't see, what she could never touch, was freedom. The world outside was a place of stories and whispers, a place where ordinary people laughed in bustling markets, where friends met in cozy tea houses, where a person could simply decide to walk down a different street just to see where it led. For a princess, These simple acts of freedom were unimaginable luxuries. Her life was a meticulously choreographed performance, and the palace was her permanent stage. Leaving wasn't an option. The gates were guarded not just to keep intruders out, but to keep the princess in. Every step she took was watched. Every word she spoke was noted. Her companions weren't chosen based on friendship or shared interests, but on status, political alliance, and what was deemed appropriate. The ladies-in-waiting who surrounded her were her attendants, her chaperones, and often her informants. Genuine, unguarded friendship was a rare and precious commodity. How could you truly be yourself when you knew that a casual remark could be reported and twisted, potentially causing a diplomatic incident or earning you the displeasure of the court? So, her world shrank. It consisted of a handful of approved courtiers, her family, and tutors. The vast, vibrant tapestry of humanity, with all its different characters and experiences, was reduced to a small, carefully selected swatch. She learned about the world through books and maps, but she could never go and experience it for herself. It's like reading a travel guide about a beautiful island, but knowing ULL, never feel the sand between your toes or the sun on your skin. Now, you might think, well, at least they got a fantastic education, and you'd be right, but only to a point. A princess's education was a tool, designed for a very specific purpose. To make her useful, she was an asset of the dynasty, a pawn in the grand game of power. She would learn multiple languages, not to read foreign poetry, but to converse fluently with the foreign prince she would one day be married off to. She learned history, not to understand the flow of human events, but to remember the lineages and alliances that dictated her family's power. She was taught music, painting, and embroidery accomplishments that made her more marketable on the royal marriage market. She learned to host gatherings with grace, to make small talk that was never too controversial, and to smile serenely even when her heart was breaking. Her education was about presentation. It was about how to be a perfect, polished representative of her dynasty. She was taught to speak well, but never to speak her mind. She was taught to be charming, but never to be challenging. She learned etiquette so complex it would make your head spin the right way to bow, the correct way to hold a fan, the precise words to use for every conceivable social situation. But what about the things that truly shape a person? What about independence, critical thinking, the skills needed to navigate the world on her own terms? These were actively discouraged. A princess who could think for herself was a dangerous princess. A princess who desired independence was a threat to the established order. Her value was not in who she was, but in what she represented and who she could be married to. Knowledge was permitted, but only the kind of knowledge that could be controlled. She could learn about the stars, but she couldn't build her own telescope and discover a new one. She could read approved philosophy, but she couldn't debate those ideas in a public forum. Her mind was allowed to be a well-tended garden, but it could never become a wild, untamed forest of free thought. Freedom of the mind was just as restricted as freedom of movement. Imagine the psychological toll of this existence. You are surrounded by luxury, yet you own nothing, not even your own future. Your schedule is decided for you, from the moment you wake until the moment you sleep. Your meals, your clothes, your conversations all are subject to approval. You are constantly on display, a living symbol of the crown, with no private self to retreat to. The loneliness must have been profound. In a palace teeming with people, a princess was often the most isolated person of all. She was raised to be above others, set apart by her royal blood. This separation started in the nursery and continued for her entire life. While her brothers might be sent out to lead armies or govern provinces, her destiny was to wait for a marriage proposal that would seal a political alliance. And that marriage was the ultimate expression of her lack of freedom. She would be sent away, often to a foreign land she had only read about in books, to marry a man she had never met. Her duty was to leave her home, her family, and everything she'd ever known, to produce heirs for another dynasty. Her personal happiness was rarely a consideration. Her duty was to the state. This isn't to say there weren't moments of joy or that all princesses were miserable. Humans are resilient. They find happiness in small things, a forbidden book, a secret friendship with a servant, a moment of quiet solitude in a hidden corner of the garden. Some princesses even managed to carve out positions of influence and power for themselves, using the very system that constrained them to their advantage. They became savvy political players, skilled diplomats, and beloved queens. But these were often the exceptions. For many, the life of a princess was one of quiet desperation, a life of waiting, watching, and wishing for a world they could see, but never join. They were birds in a gilded cage, taught to sing the songs their keepers wanted to hear, while dreaming of the open sky. So the next time you see a fairy tale about a princess in a tower, remember the reality behind the myth. The palace wasn't just a home, it was a fortress of tradition and duty. The beautiful gowns were a uniform. The education was a form of control, and the title of princess, which sounds so enchanting to us, was often a life sentence of confinement. Ever dreamed of being a princess? The lavish gowns, the opulent palaces, the fairy tale romance. For many, it's the ultimate fantasy. But what if I told you that for some princesses, marriage wasn't a fairy tale ending, but a strategic beginning, a political chess move where her life was the most valuable piece on the board? Welcome to the world of Ottoman princesses, where a wedding ring was less a symbol of love and more a golden chain of loyalty. In the vast and powerful Ottoman Empire, everything served the Sultan, and that included his own daughters, sisters, and nieces. For these imperial princesses, known as sultanas, marriage wasn't about finding a soulmate. It was an assignment, a crucial mission handed down by the Sultan himself. Their husbands weren't chosen for their charming smiles or poetic words. They were selected for their power, their influence, and their potential threat. Think about it. The Ottoman Empire was a sprawling, complex entity with ambitious governors, brilliant generals, and powerful viziers. How does a sultan keep these influential men in line? How does he ensure their unwavering loyalty when they are hundreds of miles away, commanding vast armies or governing wealthy provinces? One of the most effective tools was marriage. By marrying an Ottoman princess, a powerful man became more than just a subject. He became family. He became a damat, an imperial Sunni. This title came with immense prestige and privilege, but it also came with a heavy price. This marriage was a public declaration of the man's bond to the imperial dynasty. He was now tied directly to the Sultan. His career, his fortune, and his very life were intertwined with the imperial family. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. The princess who became his wife was a living, breathing guarantee of his obedience. She was the Sultan's eyes and ears within her husband's household. She reported back to the palace, sharing information about her husband's activities, his allies, and his ambitions. She was, in essence, a beautifully dressed intelligence agent. Imagine the pressure on these men. If a governor or general even thought about rebelling or disobeying an order, he had to look at his wife, the Sultan's daughter. He had to think about his children, who were of imperial blood. Any act of defiance against the Sultan would not just be treason against the state. It would be a betrayal of his own family. The consequences would be swift and devastating, not just for him, but for his wife and children. Their lives were the ultimate leverage. A princess's happiness, and even her safety, was directly linked to her husband's loyalty. Her life was the collateral. So, while these marriages were celebrated with incredible pomp and ceremony, with processions that lasted 4 days and dowries that could fund an army, underneath the glittering surface was a cold, hard, political calculation. The grander the wedding, the more powerful the man, and the more critical it was to bind him to the throne. These unions were designed to neutralize threats and solidify power. For the princess, it meant leaving the sheltered life of the imperial harem and entering the complex, often dangerous world of provincial politics. She was a diplomat, a watchdog, and a symbol of the Sultan's reach, all rolled into one. Let's look at a few examples. Mehrima Sultan, the beloved daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent, was married to the Grand Vizier, Rustam Pasha. This marriage solidified Rustam's position as one of the most powerful men in the empire, but it also ensured he remained firmly under Suleiman's control. Mehrima was not a passive wife. She was an active political player, advising her husband and influencing state affairs, always with the empire's interests and her father's at heart. Her marriage was a partnership, but a partnership forged in the fires of political necessity. Or consider the daughters of later sultans, who were often married off to a succession of patients. If a husband fell out of favor, was executed, or died in battle, the princess might be quickly remarried to another rising star. Some princesses were widowed and remarried multiple times, their personal lives dictated entirely by the shifting political landscape. Their duty was not to a single man, but to the dynasty. They were a constant, a permanent link between the center of power and the periphery. Their stability was in their service to the throne, not in the arms of a husband. The life of an Ottoman princess was a paradox. She was born into the highest ekalelans of society, surrounded by unimaginable wealth and luxury. She was educated, cultured, and respected. Yet her personal freedom was severely limited. Her life's path was not her own to choose. The most intimate decision of her life, who she would marry, was a matter of state policy. Her home became an outpost of the empire, and her heart had to be loyal first and foremost to her father or brother, the Sultan. It's a far cry from the fairy tales we grew up with. There was no glass slipper, no charming prince on a white horse. Instead, there was a calculated political union designed to secure power and maintain order. The princess was not a damsel in distress, waiting to be rescued. She was a key player in the great game of imperial politics. She was a living symbol of the Sultan's authority, and her marriage was a powerful weapon in his arsenal. It was a life of privilege, but also a life of profound duty and sacrifice. A golden K, where the bars were made of silk and jewels, but they were bars nonetheless. So next time you think of a princess, perhaps you'll remember the story of the Ottoman Sultan. Remember that behind the veil and the glittering tiara, there was often a sharp political mind and a heavy burden of responsibility. Saying I do was not just a personal vow, but a political act that could shape the destiny of an empire. It was her most important mission, a lifetime assignment where her own life was the ultimate guarantee of obedience. Thanks for watching. If you found this glimpse into the lives of Ottoman princesses fascinating, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more hidden stories from history. Let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like to explore. See you next time.